by the time his heart stopped. I still had the admission bracelet in my hand and sweat cooling under my collar, while the monitor screamed above us. He was 24, burning with fever, and I had to decide whether we were watching a simple infection turn savage or something we had almost missed until it was too late. 12 minutes earlier, he had walked into Maya under his own power. The night he came in, the emergency room smelled like antiseptic, wet coats, and the burnt edge of coffee that had been sitting on a warmer too long. Every bay was full. Every hallway had a stretcher parked against the wall, and the fluorescent lights gave everyone the same exhausted skin. I had been on my feet long enough for my shoulders to feel carved from stone. But fatigue never changes the rule. The patient in front of you is the only one who matters. He gave his name as Caleb Warren, 24 years old. No major medical history, no medications, no dramatic story attached to him. He walked in wearing a university sweatshirt, a sports watch, and the kind of apologetic half-smile people use when they think they are wasting a doctor's time. He told me he had a fever since the afternoon, muscle aches, chills, and a pounding headache that felt deeper than a normal cold, but he was still talking clearly and breathing fine. What caught me was not panic, but restraint. Caleb kept saying he almost stayed home, that he probably just needed fluids and sleep. That his mother would laugh if she knew he had come to the earth for what felt like the flu. Yet when I shook his hand, his skin felt too hot and too dry, and his eyes carried that glassy, inward look I have learned to distrust over 25 years of night shifts. One of my residents, Ben Keller, started the usual workup while Maya Ortiz, one of our sharpest nurses, clipped the pulse monitor onto his finger. Numbers are useful, but sometimes they become camouflage. If they are not catastrophic, people relax too early. Caleb's were uncomfortable, not terrifying. Fever, fast pulse, pressure a little soft, enough to suggest infection but not enough to explain the heaviness that had already settled in my gut. He tried to joke while Maya placed the 4, asking if we could have him out before sunrise, because he had promised to help his younger brother move apartments. Maya smiled the way good nurses do, kind without making promises, and tucked a blanket around him as another ambulance siren swelled outside. I remember thinking how ordinary he looked beneath that thin hospital sheet. How unfair it is that disaster so often arrives dressed as inconvenience. Then he rubbed his chest once, like a man brushing away a cramp, and his face changed so quickly it felt like watching a door slam in a quiet house. The color drained from his mouth, his body stiffened, and the monitor that had been merely busy turned frantic. In emergency medicine, there are moments when a room stops being crowded and becomes narrow as a blade. And that was the moment the night chose him. I have seen people fade gradually, like daylight leaving a window, and I have seen others drop as if a trapdoor opened beneath them. Caleb was the second kind. 1 second he was trying to answer Ben's questions about recent travel and sick contacts. And the next his eyes rolled back, his pulse tore upward, and the line on the monitor broke into chaos sharp enough to make every conversation in the bay die mid-breath. We moved on instinct before thought could catch up. Maya lowered the bed. Ben called out for the crash cart, and I was already at Caleb's side with my palm on his sternum, feeling a heartbeat that had become fast, useless, and then frighteningly absent. There is a particular silence families make when they realize a loved one is no longer simply ill but disappearing in front of them. And when Caleb's mother reached the doorway and saw us start compressions, that silence arrived with her. She had driven in from the suburbs after he texted her that he was probably being dramatic. And now she stood with her purse still hanging from her shoulder, as if the night had not given her time to become a mother in crisis. She kept saying his name softly, not screaming it, just repeating it as though steadiness itself could tether him to the room. A resident tried to guide her back, but her eyes locked on mine, and I hated that I had no honest comfort to offer. His blood pressure collapsed, his breathing failed, and the first lab numbers that flashed up on the screen looked ugly without being explanatory. Infection, maybe, but too fast. Dehydration, maybe, but not like this. A hidden heart problem, maybe, but the pieces did not sit together cleanly. Medicine is often described as science, but in moments like that it feels more like trying to assemble a shattered mirror while the floor keeps moving. Maya cut away his sweatshirt sleeve to place another line, and I saw her pause for half a beat. It was the kind of pause that means a good nurse has noticed what everyone else stepped past. Under the band of Caleb's sports watch, where the skin had been hidden from the casual sweep of triage eyes, there was a faint dusky rash, tiny dark marks blooming like bruised stars. My stomach dropped before my mind supplied the name. Suddenly the fever, the aches, the speed, the collapse. The cruelty of it all began to gather around a possibility I did not want to be right. I looked at Maya, and she looked back at me with the same answer already forming. And in that crowded room, the case stopped being mysterious and became terrifying. The hardest decisions in emergency medicine are not always about what can be done, but about what must be done before certainty arrives. Caleb's tests had not yet handed us a clean explanation, and the treatments we were considering were not small, harmless gestures. They meant committing staff, medication, isolation precautions, and the full force of a strained department to a diagnosis that still lived mostly in instinct, pattern, and dread. At the same time, the waiting room was full of people whose suffering was loud, visible, and easier to justify on paper. An elderly man with stroke symptoms was being prepped for transfer. A child with low oxygen was crying behind a curtain 2 bays down. And an ICU charge nurse was already warning me that our last critical bed might be taken within minutes. In hospitals, morality does not arrive as a grand speech. It arrives as a list of names competing for the same small pool of time and space. Ben wanted one more round of confirmation before we widened the net any further, and I understood why. He was not careless, only young enough to still believe that evidence should always come before commitment. But I had seen too many dangerous illnesses wear ordinary faces during their first act. And I knew the penalty for hesitation is usually paid by the patient, never by the chart. Then Caleb's mother said the sentence that made the room feel even colder. She asked whether we had assumed he was just another healthy young man with a virus because he looked too strong to be in real danger. Nobody answered her, because sometimes the accusation hurts precisely because it does not need drama to be true. Maya kept her voice low when she said the rash was spreading. Not fast enough for a camera, maybe, but fast enough for those of us standing close. Tiny marks were appearing along his wrist and forearm, and his skin had taken on that strange mottled look that tells you the body is beginning to lose its argument with itself. So the dilemma stopped being abstract. Either we treated the worst possibility now, before the proof felt comfortable, or we protected our pride, our resources, and our protocols while a 24-year-old slipped past the edge of rescue. I made the call knowing that if I was wrong, people would call it overreaction, and if I was right, no one in that room would ever forget how close we had come to calling this flu. Once I committed, the room changed shape around that decision. Orders moved faster, voices sharpened, and every pair of hands found its place with the rough grace that only comes from shared pressure. We pushed aggressive treatment for the kind of overwhelming bloodstream infection that can masquerade as a bad viral illness until it suddenly begins taking organs offline one by one, and we worked as if each minute we stole back might still matter. Caleb's body did not thank us for it. His heart rhythm staggered, his blood pressure kept falling through our fingers, and his skin grew colder even as fever still burned inside him. Every intervention felt like pouring water into a house with the roof already on fire, but stopping was never an option. Medicine is full of moments when hope is no longer confidence, just disciplined refusal. His mother stood outside the glass, both hands pressed to her mouth, while Maya stayed at my left shoulder like an anchor in a storm. At one point, Caleb's eyes opened for less than a second, unfocused and frightened, and he tried to say something around the oxygen mask. I leaned down close enough to hear only a broken fragment, something about his brother and a promise, and then he was gone behind the machinery again. The labs finally caught up to the story his body had been telling all along. The infection was not behaving like ordinary flu, or even like the routine fevers people wait out at home with sports, drinks, and denial. It was the kind of rare, explosive bacterial illness that can move from vague aches to catastrophic collapse, with almost theatrical cruelty, attacking the bloodstream so violently that healthy youth becomes almost irrelevant. We called the IQ again, harder this time, and this time there was no debate. Caleb was not a maybe anymore. He was a full emergency, the kind that drags every illusion of control out into bright light and breaks it there. Then came the longest 30 seconds of the night, when his pulse thinned to almost nothing and the monitor slowed into a line that looked like surrender. I kept my hands steady, heard Maya counting under her breath, felt Ben beside me refusing to step back, and made one final push before the room could tilt toward grief. When the rhythm returned, weak and ragged but real, no one celebrated. We were too busy understanding that survival had only just begun. After the transfer upstairs, the emergency room resumed its old rhythm with the cruelty of a city bus continuing after an accident. Another ambulance arrived. Another family argued at the desk. Another child cried because the blood pressure cuff hurt. But inside me there was still only Caleb's room, the shape of his mother's face in the glass, and the ugly knowledge that 12 more casual minutes might have turned his story into paperwork. We got the confirmation later, not as a revelation, but as a verdict. It was meningococcal sepsis, a rare and savage infection that can begin like the flu and then move through the body with devastating speed, poisoning the blood, collapsing circulation, and leaving almost no room for delay. By then, the hidden rash under the watch strap no longer felt like a detail. It felt like the tiny hinge on which an entire life had swung. Caleb survived the night, though survival did not look cinematic. It looked like machines, swelling, sedation, and a mother signing forms with shaking hands, because hope in hospitals is often administrative before it is emotional. He would face days of uncertainty and a longer recovery than anyone in that waiting room could have imagined when he first walked in, apologizing for taking up our time. Ben found me near dawn with the kind of expression residents wear when a case has rearranged them from the inside. He said he kept replaying the beginning, trying to find the exact second where ordinary concern should have become alarm. I told him medicine would break him if he spent his life searching for perfect hindsight, but it might save people if he learned to respect the whisper before the scream. Maya was quieter than both of us. She just set her chart down, rubbed the bridge of her nose, and said she almost missed the rash because his watch was tight against the skin. Almost is a dangerous word in an emergency department. Sometimes it means nothing, and sometimes it means a funeral. When Caleb's mother came back down later, she did not thank us the way television families do. She looked to wrung out for speeches. She only touched my arm and asked me to promise that the next young person with a fever would be looked at twice, not once, and I told her the truth after her son. Would be. There are cases you remember because they were complicated, and there are cases you remember because they were honest. Caleb's was honest. It stripped away the professional comfort of algorithms and reminded me that danger does not always arrive looking dramatic. Sometimes it comes in wearing a sweatshirt, speaking politely, and apologizing for being a burden while death gathers quietly under a watchband. I have spent more than half my life in rooms where monitors beeped over prayers, apologies, confessions, and silence. Over time, people think experience makes you harder, but that is not exactly true. What it makes you is more alert to the fragile theater of ordinary life, to the fact that a brother can be waiting for help with an apartment move while across town An unseen infection is already deciding whether he will have one. The lesson Caleb left me was not that doctors must become paranoid. It was something more difficult and more humane than that. We have to remain interruptible by doubt. We have to let the small detail, the uneasy feeling, the nurse's pause, the mother's question, crack open the first easy explanation before it seals into certainty. That is harder than it sounds, especially in a crowded American emergency room built on speed, triage, and the constant pressure to move, decide, discharge, repeat. Efficiency saves lives, but so does humility, and the two are not always natural friends. Every seasoned clinician has at least one scar shaped like the moment they almost trusted the obvious, answer more than the living person in front of them. When I think about Caleb now, I do not first remember the arrest or the rushing feet or the near-flat line on the monitor. I remember the heat of his hand when he told me he probably did not belong there. I remember how close we came to agreeing with him. So that is what I carry from that night, and what I would hand to anyone watching from the safety of a screen. Do not worship panic, but do not dismiss the body's quiet warnings either. The illnesses that change lives the fastest are often the ones that first look small enough to ignore. And dignity sometimes begins with one person deciding to look again.